Hello, Larry Price. Welcome to Mexico City. We are.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for being here, and we would like to get to know better, please.
Okay.
So, Larry, can you tell us, please, where are you from?
I was born in Chicago, and I moved to Israel almost 40 years ago.
Wow, that's quite an experience.
Yes.
Okay.
And I've been working as a journalist more or less since I arrived in Israel, in print, radio, and television.
And what kind of journalist? Everything?
Yes. It started out everything, and the last 3 films I've made have been about the Holocaust.
Okay. Can you tell us about your films?
The films that I'm here for, first of all, I'm very happy to be invited to be here. It's an honor and a pleasure. And Jaime Muro approached me to please come and screen these films. And I'm going to show 3 films. The first film is something called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. And Hitler's Jewish Soldiers is about the almost 150,000 men of Jewish origin who served in the Wehrmacht, in the German army, during World War II. And I interviewed four of these men, 2 of whom were halachically Jewish. Their mothers were Jewish. And they were drafted into the German army in 1935, and some of them served all the way through until the end of the war. And one man was even proud to have been a German officer in the German army. Although he was a social democrat, and after the war opened a publishing company to promote democracy. He was not a Nazi, very intelligent man. So one of the stories in that film was of Major Ernst Bloch, who was a major in the German army as a career officer. He started out when he was 16 years old in the German army. And his father was a Jewish doctor from Berlin. And he went to work for the Abwehr, which was the German military intelligence branch. And in 1939, in September, when the war broke out, he was asked by his boss, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, to go to Warsaw and rescue the Lubavitch Rebbe, who was trapped in Warsaw when the war broke out. Which is very strange because the Germans were sending a German officer to rescue a Jew from the Germans. A very unusual set of circumstances, which happened because the American State Department was getting pressure to save the Rabbi Schneerson. So to throw a bone to the Jewish community that Roosevelt was doing something for the Jews, he agreed to rescue the Lubavitch Rebbe. And then through backdoor channels, the Germans thought that if they could do something for the Americans, maybe the Americans wouldn't go to war after the war started with Britain and France. So they wanted to do something, so they asked Canaris, who was one of the top men in the German army, to go and rescue the Lubavitch Rebbe. So that's that story, how Ernst Bloch went and rescued the Lubavitch Rebbe from Warsaw. Famous story. And I've interviewed people that were there. We tell the whole story about Ernst Bloch. I interviewed his daughter. And he died in 1945 defending Berlin as a German officer fighting against the Allies. And then then you're into the third film, which is something called The Rescue Train, which is the story of the rescue of thousands of Jewish children who were orphaned in the Holocaust, and how they were brought out of the Christian homes that had rescued them, really. The Christian families had received Jewish children from Jewish parents who saw that they were being arrested, so they gave many of the children over to Polish friends, churches, whatever, to hide the children. So these were called the hidden children. And Rabbi Isaac Herzog, who was then the chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine, believed that it was his religious duty to go and bring these children out of the Christian homes and bring them back to Judaism, because their parents had died because they were Jews. So why should the children not also become Jews? And many of the children didn't want to go, because they were living with these Christian families, and that was their family, that they were raised by them. There was their mother and there was their father. And the Christian families had risked their lives saving these Jewish children, because back in those days, if a Jew was found in a Polish home, not only was the family in that home killed, but also the families on the street, in the building. Anybody that could have known that there was a Jew in that house was also killed. So Rabbi Herzog organized a network of what he called operatives to go and find these Jewish children and bring them out of the homes that they were being hidden in. Sometimes they were bought for $50 to pay these people back for the monies that they spent raising the child. And sometimes they were paid more money, and sometimes when the families were so attached to the children that they didn't want to let them go, then they were kidnapped and they were brought out. And they were brought to Jewish orphanages. I interviewed people that were in these Jewish orphanages, and then he organized a train to bring the children from all these Jewish orphanages onto a train in just outside Kotowice, a place. They were in Ostrava. They brought to Kotowice, and then they got on a train and they crossed the Polish border. And it's a whole story about how they got into Czechoslovakia, because in those days the border was closed. How could they get across the border? And then they were there for 6 weeks in the Pirce refugee camp. And how is that possible when even anybody going across could only get 3 days? And eventually they got to France, and two of the men that I interviewed that were on the train eventually wound up on the Exodus, and they came to Israel on the famous Exodus ship. Rabbi Herzog's son became the 6th president of Israel, Chaim Herzog, and his grandson became the head of the Labor Party and a minister in a couple of the governments, Isaac Bushi Herzog, named after his grandfather. So it's a very interesting story about the rescue of hidden children and Jewish orphans after the Holocaust was over in 1946. And it really because you had hundreds of thousands of Jews who had come back from the camps and come out of hiding, and they came back to their homes in Poland, and they knocked at the door and they said, "This is my apartment and that's my furniture." And generally what happened is that they were beaten, thrown down the stairs, and some of them were killed. And there was even a pogrom in Pirce in 1947 where I think 42 Jews were killed in this pogrom. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism, there was a lot of danger, and Rabbi Herzog thought that it was best to get the children out and bring them to safety. And most of them wound up in Israel.
Wow. Okay, so most of these 3 movies that you are part of it, what drove to you did you make these movies?
Yes.
Okay, what drove to you? What was the idea? What the motivation was for you?
Well, as a filmmaker, you're always interested in doing an interesting story. And the idea of Jewish men in the German army was something that I found to be a conundrum, an enigma. It didn't make sense to me. How is it possible that Jewish men were in the German army? So I started to investigate how that was possible, and it's mainly because they were drafted into the army. In those days, the Germans were drafting half Jews, Mischlinge, anybody half Jew, quarter Jew, eighth Jew. Full Jews were not allowed in the army, but the half Jews, the Mischlinge, were allowed in the army. And many of them stayed in the army all the way through because they felt it was, one of them told me, it was safer to be in the army than it was to be hiding out in Berlin and it's true. One of the things people don't realize is there were over 4,000 Jews in Berlin during World War II with stars, and but because of the international press following what was going on in Berlin, they weren't taken away. They did not have an easy life. They were thrown out of their apartments. They were given special food rations. Their lives were very difficult, but many of them survived the war living in Berlin. At one point, in April, they were told to take off their stars because Goebbels had promised Hitler that Berlin would be Judenfrei, would be free of Jews. And he couldn't do anything about that, so he just told them to take off their stars, and from then on there were no Jews in Berlin. Strange stories. So I got involved in this because the stories were very interesting, and they had, I think that there were stories that hadn't been told, and that it was an interesting footnote, I think, in the history of the Holocaust.
And how long did it take to you to make these 3 movies?
Each one of the films took about 3 years to do. Yeah,
so
from
it's
start
a
to
long
finish.
process.
It's a very long process. For the rescue train, I actually went back to Poland, and I retraced the steps of the train. I went on the train, and I followed the same route that the children took. I had to go and find a train that was almost identical to the train that they were on, and I had to film that train to give it a feeling of reality. And I went back to the orphanage where many of these people were and filmed the orphanage and the towns and the whole area.
And tell me something, at a point that you are making these movies, do you feel a risk? Did you feel a risk or something that you can tell this was a crucial point when you started to say, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna finish it, or maybe you feel afraid of something to tell a story, or did you feel something strange in doing?
No, these are not the kind of stories that anybody was worried about being told. There was no secrets that I was going to tell. There was no danger involved, except for standard stuff you find in a city of muggings, but otherwise anti-Semitism. No, I didn't encounter that in any of the films. I don't think that there was a danger in doing the films in this respect.
Can you please tell us something that it was very deep down to your heart, that stayed in your heart, these stories that make you realize that you are doing this for the next generation so the story can be told?
Each film had a different element to it that was, I think, more interesting. One of the things that I saw in the first film that I thought was important was the intermarriage. Many of these Jewish families, these Mischlinge, the children that were raised, they were half Jewish, were the product of intermarried families. The assimilation in Germany was intense. Jews wanted to fit in, and many Jews married a Christian woman or a Christian man, which turned out to be good for those Jews in Berlin because in one case, the Jewish man was, his brother-in-law was a big Nazi officer, so they couldn't arrest him without the brother-in-law starting to pull strings to save him. They were deeply involved and integrated into the German community. So I found that even though people who were so deeply ingrained in the Jewish community and had intermarried, thinking that if they became Christian, because many of them were raised as Christians, not as Jews, that they were giving up their Jewish heritage, and now they're a Christian part of the German culture. What I discovered was that was no longer true. These people they couldn't hide from being Jewish. Ultimately, it caught up to them. And I thought that was a story that impacted children around the world.
Okay, and tell me something. In your personal project that you have right now, something that you can tell us about it?
Well, there's two projects I'm working on. One is a story that's above the story of the rescue train. Rabbi Herzog brought the children out on a train, brought them across the Czech border, brought them into the DP camp in Czechoslovakia, and then got them out of Czechoslovakia. How did they do that if the border was closed? And if you couldn't stay in Czechoslovakia, how is it possible that they could stay in Czechoslovakia? So it turns out that there was a man named Zoltán Toman, who was the Deputy Minister of the Interior in Czechoslovakia. And he made a deal with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee that he would allow the borders to stay open for the Jews. And he worked within the Czech government to make sure that the Jews always could come across, and he made sure that Rabbi Herzog's children could stay for 6 weeks. And in fact, in the Herzog train, Rabbi Herzog came up to the Czech-Polish border, and it was Shabbat, it was the Sabbath, was the sending. And he said, "That's it, we're getting off the train." He had 500 children with him, but we're not going any farther. So he got off the train, and now what do you do with 500 children and the teachers that were with them and Rabbi Herzog? And it was a small town called Ostrava, right on the border. Go find hotels, go find food, go find shelter. So they scurried around, and they all wound up someplace. And apparently, the joint was involved, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and they called Zoltán Toman, and he helped arrange some of the things, and then make sure another train came, because after the Shabbat, then they had to still get to Prague. So they wound up in that way. So I'm investigating the story of Zoltán Toman, who in 1982 came to Ben Gurion University and received an honorary